So, um, can everybody see my screen okay? Just double checking. Okay, cool. So thanks everyone for coming. There's not a whole ton of us, but it's okay because that means that we get to, or you guys get more time for questions and stuff at the end if you have them. So this is Perpetual Foreigner, and it's a kind of it's like a shorter version of what we did with KCLS. It'll be about an hour long, and then we've reserved about 30 minutes at the end for questions. And then we're just going to go around for all of the presenters we have today, and everybody's going to say their name and their pronouns. And I'll start. So I'm Garrett, and my pronouns are he, him. And then Carson, if you want to go next.
Yeah, I'm Carson. I'm also he, him.
I'm Olivia. My pronouns are she, her.
My name is Jada. My pronouns are she, her.
I'm Sophia. My pronouns are she, her.
And I'm Lauren, and my pronouns are she, her.
Awesome. And then, yeah, so if you guys have any questions during the presentation, you can just put them in the chat and we'll address them after everybody has presented. And then, of course, if you want to, just ask your questions out loud at the end of the presentation, but we just ask that you don't unmute during the presentation to ask your question. Before we begin, we wanted to acknowledge that we are on Duwamish land here in the Seattle area. So yeah, just a land acknowledgement. And then we're just going to go straight into our first part.
Okay, so before this presentation starts, I want to acknowledge a couple things quickly. So first of all, keep in mind, we're not experts on these topics, but we are super well educated on them because we have researched them for many months. And then also for this portion of the presentation specifically, note that for ethnic groups I'll be focusing on, I'm going to be focusing pretty much solely on the effects of the railroad on specifically Chinese workers and then the effects of Chinese workers on the railroad. Okay, so before we get into everything else, I'm going to give you some quick background on the railroad itself. So the Transcontinental Railroad was originally known as the Pacific Railroad, and it connected the eastern seaboard with the Pacific coast. So the company that built it was owned by a man named Charles Crocker, which is an important name to remember because he'll come up many more times throughout this presentation. So construction of the railroad finished May 10th, 1869. It was one of the most important innovations of its time, and actually of all time, because it was crucial in the rapid growth of the US economy, and it also opened the West to migration, which allowed people to move and transport items much more easier and more efficiently. This actually also helped global trade because items could get to ports much quicker and more cheaply. And so, yeah. Also, one more important thing to note is that up to 20,000 Chinese workers were involved in the building of this railroad.
All right, so before we talk more about these laborers, we're going to conduct a quick poll to see what you guys already know. There should be a poll popping up on your Zoom screen right now, but if you cannot see it, you can go ahead and put what you think the correct answer is in the chat. So I'll just go ahead and read the question here. How much did the Chinese laborers make each month in today's value? And the answers are A, $600, B, $100, C, $400, and D, $200. And I'll give everyone a minute to answer. All right, so it looks like most of you guys selected $100. Not quite. They actually made around $400 per month in today's value. But despite that amount of money, it was still barely enough to live off of. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the laborers. So in the 1800s, Chinese immigrants weren't accepted for many jobs. So they accepted any work opportunities that they could get. And because of this, Chinese immigrants made up the majority of the workers in the construction of the railroad. It was cheap labor for the railroad company, and it was paid labor for the Chinese workers, so it was a win on both sides. What's interesting is that the railroad company's original plan was to actually have German and Irish workers, but this offer was refused by the German and Irish workers because they didn't want to work in the rough conditions of the railroad construction. And as a result of this, the Chinese laborers joined the workforce. Unfortunately, they were treated very poorly. They had to live in tents and got paid very little. they had to work 6-day weeks and had to pay for food and housing, unlike the white workers that were hired who didn't have to pay for anything. In addition, their wages were only 1/2 to 2/3 of what the white workers got. As we just discussed, they received $400 per month, or if you calculate that annually, that's $4,800 per year. All right, so matters get worse if we take a look at the working conditions of these workers. So I'm going to do that by explaining one task that the workers had to do, which was blast and cut through the Sierra Mountains, which was made out of solid granite in many places. So there were many difficult things about this. First of all, the explosives that the workers were given were very ineffective. So workers were endangering their lives to get very little work done. Also, in the high altitudes that they were working in, it was already really hard to breathe because of the thin oxygen, and the explosives just made everything worse by clouding up the air with dust and dirt. Another thing workers had to do was build trestles, which, if you don't know what those are, they're essentially these really tall bridges across canyons. And in order to do this, they would have to hang off of cliffs or portions of the bridge that were already built. And in many cases, this was hundreds of meters off the ground. If they fell, they'd obviously die, so this task was extremely risky. An even worse task was when workers had to hang over cliffs and chip holes for dynamite. If they ignited the explosives and weren't pulled away from the area they were hanging off of quick enough, the dynamite would explode while they were still in the explosion radius, which would result in severe injuries or death. Working in the mountains, they also had to transport large quantities of dirt and rubble, and because of how much of this material they had to carry at once, often these workers would develop back issues or other health issues related to their posture. And one more thing is that depending on the season, there would be rock avalanches or snow avalanches, and both hot and cold weather that led to either extreme dehydration or hypothermia. And along with all of these physical conditions, racism just kept getting worse. In fact, their boss, whose name is Charles Crocker, said that Chinese workers were so much alike personally that no human being could tell them apart. And this really just shows how he saw them all as one person and not individuals with their own lives. He saw them as inferior to white people, which sadly was the case for many people at the time.
Okay, so to really emphasize these awful working conditions, I'm going to talk about a specific event that happened at Promontory Summit. So at this time, workers laid just over 10 miles of track in a single day, and this was on April 28th, 1869. So the reason they had to do this is because their boss, Charles Crocker, made a $10,000 bet with Thomas Durant, who owned the Union Pacific Railroad, which was just another railroad that connected with Crocker's. And in this bet, he said that his workers could do the impossible, which was build 10 miles of track in one day. So to do this, the workers had to work for 14 consecutive hours, with several thousand Chinese laborers working to achieve it. The total weight lifted that day was 4,462,000 pounds, which is 2,231 tons. This comes out to about 1 ton per person, which is the weight of lifting a small car. And while this may not seem like a lot because they had 14 hours to do it, keep in mind they also had to move this material around, sometimes hundreds of feet. And then also they'd have to hammer it into the ground using spikes. So it wasn't like they were just lifting it and setting it back down. Also, in many cases, the track had to be curved. And so the workers would have to manually bend each of these rails to curve it. And to do this, they would have to place each rail on top of 2 blocks and then force them into the curve shape by repeatedly striking them with a heavy hammer, which obviously was super time consuming and tiring. So keep in mind, this was a major achievement because nothing like this had ever been completed before. So, it was an example of Crocker overworking his workers, it also showed the sheer power of accomplishment that came with having numerous skilled workers and showed that even what had previously seemed impossible was now possible. However, the 8 Irish workers that accompanied the Chinese workers had their names recorded and were brought to Sacramento and were cheered on in a parade for this accomplishment, while not a single Chinese worker got any form of recognition, which shows how undervalued and ignored their efforts were, even though construction would have been impossible without them.
Now I'm going to talk a little bit of their living conditions outside of construction. So Chinese workers lived in groups called work gangs, which were basically a group of many Chinese workers with one white contractor who was usually Irish. And these gangs lived in the same house and often had a shared cook and doctor that they hired because these were not things that were supplied by the railroad company. Some Chinese people possessed extremely useful skills, such as masonry techniques, which they used to make the retaining walls around the railroad. And these techniques were actually so good that the retaining walls became famous for their strength and endurance. But despite this, Chinese workers were almost never assigned specialized work, which gave them a lower pay than the white workers who were able to specialize in their work. The white workers got to lay the tracks, while the Chinese workers had to do the common and dangerous labor, such as tunneling and exploding rock. And if laying the tracks was ever dangerous in any way, for example, in the desert in 100-degree weather, then this job was then transferred to the Chinese workers. And just a side note, the picture you see on the right here is one of the ways that the workers used nitroglycerin to explode the rock.
Okay, so now getting into another extremely important subtopic, which is food and disease. So keep in mind, Chinese laborers had to provide their own food, while white workers got it for free. And not only were the white workers getting free food, they were getting extremely good food, such as meat and potatoes with whiskey. Well, the Chinese workers couldn't afford much, so they had to eat a lot of dried food, such as dried fruits, vegetables, and dried seafood like fish and oysters. They also drank mostly hot water and tea, and only had wine if they could afford it on occasion, which was very rarely. So this difference in diet actually led to the Chinese workers contracting diseases less than the white workers, even though they made a much larger portion of the workforce. So this was mostly due to the Chinese workers using boiled water in their drinks, which helped reduce the amount of germs they had because germs can't survive in high heat. Though their less meat-heavy diet also did help with this. So this meant that not only were the Chinese workers doing much more work than the white workers, but they also got paid less and contributed less to the amount of disease circulating between the workers, even though they were being blamed for all of the diseases that were popping up at this time.
All right, so abuse and attempts to escape. There's been a few incidents where Chinese workers have tried to escape this job. And one such incident resulted when the Chinese workers realized that the hours that they were forced to work were actually much longer than they had initially agreed to when construction started. And because of this, many of the workers wanted to leave or get higher pay. Many of them tried to leave the railroad to work in nearby mines where the pay was higher. However, because abuse against Chinese people was ignored by law enforcement back then, their overseers abused them to stop this and got no repercussions. Because of this, Chinese workers went on a strike on June 25th, 1867. But once again, they were abused, with their boss, Charles Crocker, cutting off their supplies and forcing them to either stop the strike or starve to death.
Okay, so what this whole portion of the presentation really boils down to is that the Chinese workers were not treated as equals to the white workers. So first of all, they had harder work, as we've said before, like more difficult and dangerous labor. They also got no extra benefits, unlike the white workers who were getting free food and free housing. Also, the white workers were paid far more than the Chinese workers and had better housing. So while the Chinese workers were living in tents, the white workers got really nice housing for free. And the only way the Chinese laborers could actually get this housing is if they could, first of all, pay for it. And then secondly, if all of the white workers had already got the housing they wanted. And then last of all, there was racism going on at this time to the point where the original plan wasn't even to hire Chinese workers because Charles Crocker didn't believe that they could do this kind of work. And so as we've said, the original plan was to have the German and Irish workers come in, but they didn't want to. And so the Chinese labor was used instead, with the Chinese workers being paid much less than the previous workers and having to live in tents because they didn't need incentives to get them to stay. And so Crocker didn't have to pay them as much because they kind of had to take any jobs they could get. So essentially they weren't even really wanted, and they were only there because Crocker had no other options.
All right, so now we're going to run another poll. What percentage of the workforce were Chinese laborers? And once again, the screen on the Zoom should be popping up again. And the answer choices are A, 50%, B, 10%, C, 75%, and D, 90%. All right, so it looks like everyone chose 75%. But actually, about 90% of the workers were Chinese. This is a really large percentage of the workforce, and a lot of times people don't know that many of the workers were Chinese, and this just kind of shows how the Chinese workers were so underrepresented. All right, so to kind of summarize all the information we just gave into some numbers, 15 to 20,000 laborers worked to build the Transcontinental Railroad, 90% of which were Chinese workers. And in total, there were around 2,000 deaths from explosions, avalanches, heat, and all the other causes that we discussed earlier. And 1 in 9 Chinese workers died because of these causes. And lastly, every day, Chinese workers had to transport around 800 pounds of rock, in addition to doing any other tasks that they were assigned.
Okay, so one of the last slides here for this part of the presentation is this is an image of the golden spike, which was put in by Leland Stanford. So the golden spike was just the final spike that completed the railroad. One thing I want you guys to notice is how everyone here is white. So even though Chinese Americans made up 90% of the work effort, they weren't allowed to be at this event, which marked the completion of the railroad because of racism and people seeing them as inferior at the time and believing that they weren't worthy of being at this event, which really just shows how racist pretty much everyone was at this time. And Crocker really just didn't want people to know that Chinese workers had worked to build this railroad. He wanted to make it look like it had all been white workers. Okay, so now to get into the actual impacts both back then and today. So there was an increase in both the number and intensity of racial conflicts after this event because people felt that their jobs were being stolen by these Chinese laborers, which led to anti-Chinese sentiments. And then there were also violent campaigns after this that served to try to make Chinese people leave the United States, which eventually actually did result in bans on Chinese workers immigrating to the US until 1943, which was only 78 years ago. And if you think about it, that's still pretty recent history. So eventually Chinese workers were even denied citizenship and entry into the United States. And this will be talked about more in the next presentation. So that being said, I'm going to let the next presenter go into more detail on these impacts.
All right, so that transitions into our next topic, which is the history of immigration acts directed towards Asian Americans. But before I start talking about specific immigration acts, I wanted to go over the concept of the American dream, because it was and still is a factor that influenced immigration. So in general, the American dream is defined as the ability to choose your own future no matter your upbringing in the United States. And as you can see on the screen, there's a bunch of quotes, and these are pulled from attendees of the original Perpetual Foreigner series in February when we asked them the question, what does the American dream mean to you? And if you take a moment to just skim over these quotes, you can see that they reflect a lot of the same ideas of, having opportunities, equal access to resources, and the ability to shape your own future. But despite being such a widespread idea, the American dream is definitely not equally achievable by the different groups in the United States. And as I go over the different legislation that negatively impacted the Asian American community in the past, you'll be able to see all of the additional obstacles that the Asian American community had to face to achieve their American dream. All right, so now I'm going to talk through some of the major immigration acts since 1850. The first large wave of Asian Americans that came to the US were that of the Chinese Transcontinental Railroad that we just talked about. So during this initial wave, there was kind of a common belief that Chinese people and other people of color were both intellectually and fundamentally inferior to white people. And this can be seen through these two acts on the screen. So the first one is People versus Hall, which was a Supreme Court ruling in 1850. And essentially, it stated that Chinese people are not allowed to testify in court. The second one was passed in 1878. It's called In Re A Yup, and essentially it stated that Chinese people were not allowed to be naturalized citizens in the US. And both of these acts sent a message to the Asian American immigrants at the time that they will always be foreign in the eyes of the law. And this was the beginning of many reasons of why Asian American immigrants saw and still see themselves as the perpetual foreigner. So another huge obstacle Asian Americans had to face was the foreign miners tax of 1850. And what this was, it's pretty self-explanatory, but it was a monthly tax that had to be only paid by foreign miners. The tax was $20 a month, which is equivalent to $690 per month today. And this act greatly impacted the Asian American community financially. And just to show this, I have an example. So in 1870, it was recorded that the Chinese miners in California paid a total of $5 million in foreign miners tax. And to put that into perspective, that is equivalent to paying $100 million today. All right, so before we go into the next section, just a quick poll. So what did the court decision in Ray Yup state? A, Chinese immigrants are not allowed to testify in court. B, the Chinese government is not allowed to issue passports to citizens wanting to immigrate to the US. C, Chinese immigrants cannot be naturalized citizens in the US. And D, $20 per month tax on all foreign miners. So once again, I'll wait for everyone to answer and look at the results. All right, good. Most people got it. It's that Chinese immigrants cannot be naturalized citizens in the US, as we just discussed. All right. So the next act is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So this was the first significant law restricting immigration into the United States. It suspended all Chinese immigration for 10 years, despite the fact that Chinese people only made up 0.002% of the nation's population at the time, and essentially it was enacted to maintain quote-unquote racial purity in the United States. And besides the Chinese, another prominent group of Asians immigrating to the United States at the time was the Japanese, and their immigration resulted in what was called the Gentleman's Agreement of 1908. And essentially what this was the Japanese government agreed to deny passports to Japanese citizens trying to immigrate to the United States if the United States government protected the rights of Japanese immigrants and their families already in the United States. And essentially this act greatly reduced, or some people say even stopped, Japanese immigration after 1908. Okay, so moving on to World War I. So during the years of World War I, xenophobia was at an all-time high, and lots of anti-Asian propaganda was being spread all over the country. So the acts that were beginning to be passed during this time began to group nationalities together and just target the Asian race as a whole. So what you can see on the right of the slide is a map, and what the zone in red is what was called the Asiatic Zone of Barred Citizenship. And the 1917 Immigration Act basically pushed out this map and restricted all Asians and Pacific Islanders in this red zone from entering the United States. So in 1924, there was a second Immigration Act, and it was also fueled by the large amounts of anti-Asian hate at the time. It built upon the act in 1917 that we just discussed and just completely barred all Asians and Pacific Islanders from entering the United States. Okay, so next poll. Which act barred Chinese citizens from the Asiatic Zone from entering the United States? So we have the Gentleman's Agreement of 1908, the 1924 Immigration Act, 1917 Immigration Act, and the Magnuson Act of 1943. All right, so most people chose the 1917 Immigration Act, which is correct. Some people probably got it confused with the 1924, but essentially, you just have to know that both of those acts just greatly unfairly restricted Asian American immigration into the United States. All right, so over time, the bans on immigration that were set by these two immigration acts were slowly repealed. So in 1952, the American government allowed 2,000 people from the Asian Pacific Barred Zone, which is the red zone that was shown before. So the government allowed 2,000 people from this zone to immigrate to the United States each year. And this decision was called the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952. And finally, in 1965, there was the second Immigration and Nationality Act, And this completely repealed the 1924 Immigration Act and once again allowed Asian Americans to immigrate to the United States. So this caused the Asian American population to increase by a lot. Islander population more diverse. So before 1965, the Asian American population was mostly made out of Chinese and Japanese Americans just because they were the main immigrants prior to 1924. But data from the US Census, as shown on the screen through that graph, shows how after 1965 there was a huge spike in Asian American immigrants. And one example of a large wave of immigration after 1965 would be the immigrants and refugees from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam that occurred after the Vietnam War. All right, so essentially what you should be taking away from this section is that Asian American people have been long excluded in America. The immigration acts that we talked about are part of the perpetual foreigner myth that Asian American in this country battle every single day. And it's important to learn about the history of this racism so that we can better identify racism in more modern times. And now I'm going to pass it on to the Supreme Court cases group.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so this is kind of the second part, kind of the second part of our seminar. And so this is called a systemic pursuit, and it talks about the Supreme Court and API's legal fights for equality. So throughout, we will kind of see this theme of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and you guys will kind of see what that means once we get into it. And I promise that even though the Supreme Court sounds like kind of a boring topic, we actually found this to be one of our favorite topics to research. And so we wanted to and white Americans, although many of the court cases that we will be talking about apply to Asians as a whole. It just happens that like the majority of the Asians in America during the time of these Supreme Court cases happen to be Chinese Americans, but just keep in mind that they're very largely applicable to, or like cross-applicable to a lot of different Asians.
So before we start getting into like the content portion of this presentation, we just kind of wanted to get your brains moving, and we asked the question of what are a few words or a phrase that comes to mind when you think of the Supreme Court. If you feel comfortable, you can put it in the chat. If not, just kind of think it inside of your head. But I encourage you to revisit that idea at the end of this presentation. And the words that came to our mind was white supremacy. And you'll kind of see why we say that during this presentation. So anyways, unlike Garrett, I actually think the Supreme Court is fascinating. And so I am gonna give you guys a little bit of background of how things get to the Supreme Court. It's a very big topic. It has a lot of complexities, but we broke it down into 4 steps. So if you kind of see the graphic that I have on the screen, it shows like the process. So the first step is just to have a legal issue. For court cases, you can either have a civil issue, which would be a lawsuit, or a criminal issue. And once you have that issue, you go to step 2, which is to get rejected by your state judges. Most of you probably already know this, but you can't just take a case and immediately go to the Supreme Court. You have to start at the lower courts and kind of work your way up. So a lot of lower courts include like circuit courts. That would be the courthouse that's in your city or in your county. And then like the Court of Appeals, and then the federal courts, and you go all the way up to the court system in your own state. And then the next step after that would be to go to the Federal Court of Appeals. This is at the federal level, and this would have to be a pretty serious issue that you have. And then after that, you would be put into a gigantic pool of people to even be considered by the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court only takes about 80 cases a year, which may sound like a lot, but considering there's thousands of cases that they have to choose from, it's really not much. In order for a case to be considered by the Supreme Court, 4 of the justices have to agree to it. So it has to be a majority. And they typically try to choose cases that have diversity to them, so a lot of different issues. And usually if there is an existing case, they try to find one that may overturn it or may somehow further what's in the Constitution. So that's kind of what goes through their mind when they're picking cases. But I think this graphic kind of explains well that you have to be lucky. So oh, sorry, Gary, you can go ahead. The next graphic that you have on your screen is of some other scenarios where a case can get to the Supreme Court. So I know I literally just said you have to go through all of that to get to the Supreme Court. That is not always true. There are some times where you have a special case, and there's a lot of special cases that are up there, but the most important one is that if the United States is the person that has legal issue, they get to kind of circumvent all of that and go straight to the Supreme Court, in which the Supreme Court would be hearing an original case. So now that we've got all that out of the way, hopefully it'll make it easier to understand the cases that we're going to talk about now.
So we're going to start out with a case called Wong Kim Ark versus the US, which took place in 1897. So for some context, this is kind of one of the first waves of Chinese immigration, and it's after the Civil War by just like a few decades or a couple decades. So yeah, so the story begins much earlier though. In the 1870s, Wong Kim Ark was born in California since his parents immigrated before the concept of illegal immigration was even invented in the United States. And after, so at this time, many Asians, especially Chinese people, were immigrating to flee civil war, European invasion, and just to find a better life in general. And he worked in a local grocery store for years and years before the US passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. And Wong Kim's Ark family feared race-based violence. So in 1890, which is 8 years later, they fled America and went back to their village in Taishan, Guangdong, which is actually very close to Hong Kong and Macau if you're interested in geography. Anyways, after a few months, Wong Kim Ark decided to go back to the United States on his own. And since it was home, since he believed that the United States was his home since he was born and raised there, and he became a restaurant cook in America without incident. 4 years later, in 1894, at the age of 21, he visited his family in Taishan. And this is where we'll leave Wong Kim Ark for the time being, and we'll come back to him in a little bit. So yeah. And then now we're going to cut to another figure named John H. Wise, not to be confused with the Hawaiian football player who is actually a very, well, I don't know a lot about him, but he's definitely not this guy. So anyway, John Wise is the child of fierce defenders of slavery and just an overall really bad person. So in 1893, he was appointed collector of customs by President Cleveland, and he moved to California. And there, since there weren't that many Black people to discriminate against, and he was like a very racist guy, by the way, he decided to be really nasty to Asians instead. He forced any immigrants to produce arbitrary stacks of documents and pictures, effectively making it impossible to get into the United States. And he once deported a longtime US resident who was trying to see his fiance and wrote a poem about it saying, "I've sent him back to China where he can eat his mice." So unfortunately, this was largely accepted by the American populace who believed that mass immigration of Asian people was an unarmed invasion, despite it being the result of America's own conquests in the Pacific. So this brings us back to Wong Kim Ark, who tries to enter the US again. And this time he runs into John Wise's new laws, and he was deemed not an American citizen and detained for deportation. Ark, with the help of the Chinese Immigrant Aid Society in San Francisco, sued for the violation of habeas corpus as he was detained without trial. They argued that the US's 14th Amendment, which says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States, are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. And they basically said that plain text basically made Ark a citizen. However, anti-immigrant groups at this time had been ready for such a case for a very long time. And the question of the case was essentially whether the US would adopt a policy of jus soli, or the right of soil, or jus sanguinis, which is the right of blood. So anti-immigrant groups argued that Ark's culture was so different that he could not possibly be an American. Also, they claimed that the accident of birth couldn't warrant a citizenship. So this case was argued from March of 1897 and was decided 1 year later, which is surprisingly long for what is now considered to be one of the most straightforward Supreme Court cases with the plain text of the 14th Amendment that we discussed just now. So the court sided with Wong Kim Ark and set the precedent of jus soli, or citizenship of children born to the US or in the US to non-citizen parents. So because Ark was born in the United States and his parents were not quote unquote employed in any diplomatic or official capacity under the Emperor of China, the citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment automatically made him a US citizen. However, it's important to note that while the court largely sided with ARC, it was for the benefit of white immigrants. So if they didn't, it wouldn't just be Chinese immigrants being deported, but they would also be forced to deport Europeans. Therefore, in many ways, while this was a major step forward, it was also underlined by like this kind of racist rhetoric nonetheless.
So the next case that we're going to talk about is called Lau versus Nichols. And before I get into like the actual facts of this case, I want to talk about segregation and the civil rights movement in general. So this case took place in 1973, and I'll kind of go more into what actually happened on the next slide. But for as many of you probably already know, 1973 was less than 10 years after 1965, which was when a very major Civil Rights Act was passed and when most of the United States, if not all, was forced to desegregate and the schools were forced to integrate. And a lot of people kind of think about that in terms of Black Americans, but as you've probably seen from this presentation, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders almost always become the scapegoat for the bigotry and discrimination from white supremacists and just racist people. And so in the case of this, there were a lot of states that were really, really angry, and they did not want to integrate their schools. They didn't want public places to be integrated. And the way that they retaliated was by discriminating against Asian Americans. So how does that apply to this case? So Lau versus Nichols centers around a school district in the city of San Francisco in California. And like I just talked about, they were very angry. They did not want to integrate their school system, but they had to. So the way that they got around doing it was by a loophole. They had an English as a second language instruction program, and they decided that they were not going to provide that instruction to the Chinese American students that were in their school district. These students made up most of the people that needed the instruction, and without this instruction, they could not properly participate in the school system because they couldn't get a good education and they couldn't participate like everyone else. This is a huge issue because there were about 1,800 students that were not being provided proper instruction by the school district, and they were being bullied, they were feeling isolated, and they weren't performing successfully in the school. So fortunately, this case went to the Supreme Court, and it resulted in the Supreme Court unanimously voting that the San Francisco School District could not lawfully do this under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is pretty similar to the Civil Rights Act of 1965, but it basically was just saying that you have to treat people equally and that you can't discriminate against them based off their language, their race, or any other criteria. So it ended the San Francisco School District's discrimination. However, it did not end the anti-Asian sentiment that was going on, and it did not end the bitterness that was left over from integration.
All right, so we've talked about kind of 2 steps forward, and now we're going to talk about a step back, so spoilers. But anyways, the second to last case that we're going to talk about today is very similar to a case called Hirabayashi, if you've ever heard of it. So our story begins in a very similar way, well, in actually the exact same way, with FDR signing Executive Order 9066 to intern Japanese people. I also want to note that these cases, we can really see a theme of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, in that during peace times, Asian Americans make civil rights advancements, like we saw it with the last 2 cases. But then when war breaks out or something happens, we see that Asians are the first group to be blamed for it. And this isn't really just a theme with Japanese internment or with the Supreme Court, but it's also a theme with all of Asian American history in San Francisco during the bubonic plague scare, if any of you guys know about that. During Vietnam and Korea, during the Asian Exclusion Acts, 9/11, and even today. And this will get explored more deeply later in our seminar, but it's something to keep in mind. So back to the case, Korematsu was one of the Asians who refused to be interned because he believed that he was American through and through. And actually, to try to achieve this, he got plastic surgery, he changed his name, and he actually pretended to be a completely different race, which really shows you like what lengths people were willing to go to not be interned. However, ultimately, that didn't really work out, and he ended up being interned anyways. And then, so Korematsu contested his arrest, and it was ultimately appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. And they ruled that Japanese internment was a military necessity and that wasn't actually racist. So just to kind of a positive spin on this, I guess, is that Justin Jackson ended up dissenting and argued that it violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, writing, Korematsu has been convicted of an act not commonly thought a crime. It consists merely of being present in the state whereof he is a citizen, near the place where he was born and where all his life he has lived. So Korematsu's name was cleared in 1983 by a federal judge, but technically the Korematsu v. United States ruling still stands to this day. And basically what that means is that if there is a quote unquote grave and imminent danger to public safety, executive orders that are discriminatory are still legally allowed. And yeah, so that basically it just says that like Japanese internment was legally justified and valid, which is obviously problematic. So finally, we're gonna move on to one of the more controversial legal battles that we are presenting on, affirmative action. And if you don't know what it is, there's a definition on the screen, but it's basically that if like people of a certain race, gender, or some other factor that makes them historically discriminated against are favored over those who are not. So in 2014, Students for Fair Admissions sued Harvard University for unfairly discriminating against Asian American students, saying that an AAPI applying to Harvard had a lower chance of getting in than another POC with the exact same application, and that it was racist. They basically wanted to strike down affirmative action. However, the court sided with Harvard, and there's 4 main reasons why everyone should understand as to why the court did this. First, the lawsuit and Students for Fair Admissions was run by a white, straight conservative man you might have heard of named Edward Bloom. It was really clear that he was not suing on moral ground because he had tried it previously with a white girl and received very little sympathy. This time, though, he really wanted to mobilize the AAPI community and succeeded in getting it to a court. Secondly, affirmative action is built on the premises that there will always be too many qualified candidates. So it's not as though the other students of color favored by affirmative action were not qualified. It's basically saying that if a non-AAPI POC gets the same stats and application as an AAPI, they are actually more qualified to get in since they face more hurdles to get there in the first place. Thirdly, the case grouped every AAPI together, which perpetuates the model minority myth and states that they're all the same. I mean, when you think about it, a bunch of Asians mobilized to fight education bias is very stereotypical. And in reality, not every Asian is a good student. And in terms of groupings, there are hundreds of cultures within the Asian American identity, all of whom face different struggles from one another. Finally, affirmative action is still needed today. And Jada will talk about that on the next slide.
So there's a plethora of reasons why we still need affirmative action, and it's like Garrett said, it's a pretty controversial topic. And so if you ask different people, they'll give you different reasons. But we wanted to kind of categorize it into 3 main reasons, and I'm going to go into them now. So the first reason is that students of color are underrepresented in colleges across America. So this is not an exact statistic of what I'm about to give you. It's just what I saw when I did a little bit of my own research. And I encourage you to do the same. And some of the top colleges in America, the top 10, which I looked up, most of which are Ivy League colleges, including Yale, Princeton, and Harvard, despite there being a 20% population of Latinx people in America and a 13% population of Black Americans in the United States, less than 6% made up the student body of these top colleges. And for Latinx students, it was even lower. That is a real problem. And diversity is really important and it's needed. And diversity is not just a racial issue. There can be diversity in gender, in religion, in socioeconomic status, but diversity in the classroom helps promote a more, it promotes people to be less closed-minded and to be more open with their thinking. And it also helps give them leadership opportunities and to provide them with experiences and connections that they may not have made depending on where they grew up before they went to college. So the second reason why we need affirmative action is because the biggest reason that people of color or just people in general would need affirmative action is not a racial issue, it's an economic issue. For example, a lot of schools that are low income and are not receiving a lot of funding do not have things like SAT prep, graphing calculators, enough textbooks, teachers that are paid well. And so students that are going to schools like this are not being provided with the same amount of options or prep in order to apply for the same colleges. So it's genuinely not fair. Kind of going back to what Garrett was saying about someone who is not Asian American applying, having to go through greater hurdles to get the same test scores. Additionally, college is actually still shown to increase the amount of money that a person is able to make in their later life salary-wise. And so it's really important that we provide these collegiate opportunities to people of all races. And unfortunately, even though I said it's not a racial issue, there is still a very strong tie between people of color and intergenerational poverty. And one of the ways that we can help break that correlation is by providing educational opportunities. And the third thing is that banning affirmative action only helps white supremacy. And that's for two reasons. Firstly, even though we have talked a lot about Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans, they are not the only people that make up Asian Americans in total. It's a broad swath of countries, and people from these different countries or who have ethnic backgrounds in these different countries face lots of different issues. And so to categorize them as one group and to say that they need or don't need a certain thing is just wrong. Additionally, banning affirmative action would mostly be geared to helping white students get into colleges. And for all the reasons that I said earlier, is not going to help anyone and would just promote the existing problems that we already have. So that concludes our portion of this presentation. And now I want to hand it off to Sophia.
Wait, sorry, really quickly. Am I the only one who can't hear Sophia?
No, Sophia, I can see like you talking, but I can't hear you either.
Yeah, my webcam is kind of broken, so I'll just have my camera off and talk. So we're going to shift gears and talk about something that's happened within the last year, and that's the coronavirus and the effects it had on the AAPI community. So we're going to start by talking about a phrase, which is the China virus phrase, which erases blame from other nations, primarily the US. And we all know that our response to the pandemic was really non-existent in the last year before we had the vaccine. So with the United States leading globally in COVID cases and deaths, it's really clear that we needed a better response. And the explicit discriminatory behavior perpetuated by those who presume the stereotypes representative of the scapegoating against Asian Americans, which has become all too common, like by using the phrase China virus. So it's becoming increasingly normalized to claim that calling COVID-19 the China virus or other such names is now deemed acceptable due to the other variants that are becoming relevant. Yet this is far from true. But the SARS-CoV-2 or coronavirus disease 2019 names are both more technical terms, and the taxonomy of the virus itself has continued to update over the course of the response to the pandemic. Put simply, it is abbreviated to COVID-19 due to the structure of the virus. The China virus is no longer a phrase that was indicative of location or origin. Rather, it's become emblematic of the intolerance and hatred that has been increasingly prevalent. The World Health Organization recommends against naming viruses after specific regions because it can lead people to unfairly stigmatize ethnic groups. In the United States, Asian Americans are concerned that such racialized language will make them the target of bigotry. So, Donald Trump, as you can see in this picture, he crossed out and the word corona and wrote China. And having a president who did this is actually really bad because it shows many people that it might be okay to do this. And these derogatory terms legitimize the discriminatory actions of some of the American population, especially if it's a commonly used term within the White House. So this picture was taken on March 19th by Javin Botsford, who was a Washington Post photographer. And after the briefing, Trump was defending his actions by saying that it's not racist, it just comes from China, that's why. And this incident was only the beginning of the anti-Asian hate due to the COVID-19 pandemic. It is believed that having a president openly racist towards the AAPI people made others think that it's okay to be racist as well, which is what led to slurs and other verbal attacks, as well as the much worse physical attacks. Now we're going to talk about those physical attacks. I'm sure we've all seen them in the news. I know there have been a lot of local ones too. But here are some examples. So there's an 80-year-old man from Thailand who was walking in San Francisco, and for no clear reason, he was slammed into the ground. He died 2 days later in the hospital because of this, and his family believes that the attack was a hate crime and he was targeted because of his race. Unfortunately, he's not the only victim of anti-Asian violence in the recent months. In late January, a 91-year-old man was shoved from behind by a stranger while he was walking down the street in Oakland's Chinatown. He fell down face first, but fortunately survived. This assault happened in broad daylight directly outside the Asian Resource Center, which is a gathering spot for the Asian American community. A 28-year-old man was charged in the attack. Although both episodes were caught on tape by security cameras, thousands of other physical, verbal, or digital attacks have occurred with no police record of the incidents. So we're going to talk about Vincent Chin next. And the xenophobia against Asian Americans, it's been present for centuries. And with the prevalence of the COVID-19 pandemic, hate crimes against Asian American individuals, it has risen. So these events remind us of Vincent Chin. In 1982, Vincent Chin was in Detroit, Michigan, and he died because he was attacked because of his race. During this time, there was a growing Japanese auto industry, which was leading to a major loss in Detroit's own auto sector. And two co-workers and future murderers mistook him for a Japanese person. During a celebration for his bachelor party, both co-workers used racial slurs while beating him. It was this incident that caused his death days later. This motivated individuals from diverse backgrounds to unite against anti-Asian racism through peaceful protesting, but many of those who advocated for Vincent Chin warned of similar scapegoating towards the Asian American Pacific Islander community through the lens of the COVID-19 pandemic. Instead of blaming Japan, now we're blaming China and anyone who looks Chinese, said Helen Jia, a Chinese American activist who helped found a Pan-Asian civil rights group, American Citizens for Justice, following the sentencing of Chin's killers. The two men ultimately paid a $3,000 fine and served no prison time. Jia continued that it's actually pretty terrifying for most people because we've been through this before. And we know what dog whistles, racism, and calling people who look a certain way the enemy, we know what that leads to. The recent instances of hate crimes not only impact the daily lives of Asian Americans, but discrimination in education, housing, and employment are also on the rise. The United States Commission on Civil Rights published their findings in early May to address and reduce anti-Asian xenophobia, writing that given the rise in anti-Asian sentiment reported in recent weeks and months, it is important that the federal government is conscious of the particular needs of the Asian American community. The Commission has identified widespread concerns about discrimination impacting Asian Americans in relation to education, employment, hate crimes, health, housing, and immigration enforcement. In summary, the implicit biases that transform into acts of violence that are synonymous with the COVID-19 pandemic. Now we're going to take a look at more segregation against Asians in the past with Lauren.
So now I'll be talking a little bit more about the history of hate against Asian Americans and then how that has transformed into hate today. So in the early 1900s, San Francisco segregated their school. In 1893, there was technically a policy to segregate Japanese students from schools. However, this was never enforced unless white parents had an objection. And since there were no official complaints, then this segregation never took place. Then in May 7th of 1905, the Japanese and Korean Exclusion League was created. Their first and biggest goal was to segregate schools for Japanese and Korean students. However, much of their efforts went towards segregation for Japanese students since there were only 3 total Korean students in the entire school district. Their final form of motivation for segregation came on April 18th of 1906 when a huge earthquake hit the San Francisco area. Most of the destruction done was in Chinatown, in the very heart of San Francisco. So many of the Chinese students that lived in Chinatown had to flee the area because of this destruction. The superintendent found this as a way that they could move all the Japanese and Korean students into the vacancies left by the Chinese students. So on October 11th of 1906, the San Francisco School Board of Education adopted that policy that segregated Japanese, Korean, and any remaining Chinese students left into what they called Oriental schools. So for a little bit, I'm going to talk about why the term Oriental is so demeaning and offensive. The first thing is that it is technically a regional term, but then because of this, it is often used to make Asian sound foreign and exotic. Another reason why it's extremely demeaning is because it objectifies Asians. Now, Oriental is a term that would usually be used to describe things like a rug or a vase, which is why it's extremely offensive when it's used to describe a person. So going back to that segregation, this was the very first example of Japanese students ever being segregated. However, Chinese students had previously been segregated into their own schools. So after a little bit of conflict between local and federal authorities between how integration would take place, the Gentleman's Agreement, which was talked about a little bit earlier in this presentation, passed, and that is when the schools finally integrated. And just to recap, in case you missed it, the Gentleman's Agreement practically said that those Japanese Americans that are in the US would be treated like citizens if Japanese in Japan would stop getting passports. So practically cut off immigration from Japan. So while this did help solve a huge problem in the United States, it did cause a new one overseas. And then so fast forward to late 1990s, you may have heard of the Rodney King riots, but so I'm here to talk a little bit about the Koreatown version of this. So between April 29th and May 4th of 1992, riots took place throughout LA after 4 LAPD officers were acquitted of any wrongdoing in their violent beating and arrest of Rodney King. For very obvious reasons, people were extremely upset about this verdict, and so riots broke out throughout LA. Koreatown was one of the epicenters for this violence that took place during the time, because police were very unwilling to protect this part, and therefore a lot of this violence that people had was redirected towards Koreatown. This part of LA was mainly inhabited by Korean immigrants who were store owners who had businesses that were destroyed during these riots. Now we can watch a little bit of this video just to see how that's impacted some of these people.
The victims. I mean, my parents are good Christians. I mean, we've been through so much and to go through this. I mean, everything 22 years down the drain.
Many Koreans who yesterday were the shopkeepers of South Central Los Angeles today have lost the businesses they took years to create.
What can I say? I don't have any word to say. This looks a comeback, John.
George Huang woke this morning to find his mini mall burnt to the ground. A loss of $1.5 million and a lifetime of dreams and effort.
I don't mind that. Whatever they need, take it out. But why they burn out the property? That's my question.
41 Korean businesses in South Central have been torched, dozens looted. In this overwhelmingly Black and Hispanic area, Koreans own many of the small businesses.
So as you may have heard, George Huang's business suffered $500,000 in damages. In total, Korean-owned businesses in this area suffered damages of $500 million. And just to put that in perspective, the total damages done by the riots in this entire time throughout everywhere was $1 billion. So Korean-owned businesses took up half of that. So now we can look a little bit at how this translates into present-day hate crimes against Asian Americans. So as we've seen lots of hate in the past, this is now coming back to light, especially throughout COVID. So I'm going to be reading off some numbers from a national report from this organization called Stop the AAPI Hate. And what they do is they record first-person accounts to anyone who reports to them. So two things to keep in mind is that the last national report released was on May 6th of 2021. So there is about a 2-month gap of those who may have reported in that time window. Another thing to remember is that these are only the numbers of people who do choose to report their hate incidents to this organization. So in total, about 6,600 hate incidents were reported to this organization between March 19th and March 31st. And that's about a 1-year gap. About 1,500 of these reports were before late April of 2020, which is when COVID really started up and when this harmful rhetoric of the Chinese virus was also being pushed. So this photo does a really good job of showing the types of discrimination that Asian Americans face. So the top 2 biggest types of discrimination are verbal harassment and avoidance or shunning, both of which have decreased since 2020. However, you'll notice that those are really the only 2 types of discrimination that have decreased since 2020. Almost everything else besides workplace discrimination has increased since last year. What's really great about this organization is that if people choose has happened to them. So like I mentioned earlier, verbal and shunning are the two biggest types of discrimination that took place. verbal harassment consists of 65.2% of the hate incidents, and shunning consists of 18.1% of the hate incidents. So now I'm just going to be reading off some of these people's stories. One person reported that a little kid and their kid's dad was yelling "ching chang chong" and made slanted eye mockeries towards them, and then ran away right after. One other story of a shunning says that one parent was really concerned because their kid had been bullied at school for being Asian. The kid was being told that they had COVID. Other people were telling others to stay away from them. And this even continued after schools were closed because parents would pull their kids close anytime that family would kind of get near them. So this is a photo that shows where the largest number of hate incidents are being reported. One really important thing to remember is that these numbers were recorded by Stop the AAPI Hate, which is a California-based organization. So some of these numbers may be skewed so that it makes some of the numbers look bigger in more Pacific states if there's more awareness about this organization over there. But from this data, we see that California, New York, and Washington all have the largest number of hate incidents reported, all of which have major cities in them and all of which have high Asian populations. So California has a 15% Asian population, and that's 17% including those with partial Asian ancestry. New York City itself, so excluding upstate, has a 12% Asian population, and Washington has a 9.2% Asian population. However, Asians do make up the largest minority racial group in that state. So very recently, May 20th of 2021, President Biden signed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act into law. The White House says that this requires the Justice Department to facilitate expedited reviews of hate crimes and authorizes grants to state, local, and tribal governments to prevent, address, or respond to hate crimes. So this bill is extremely complex and has over 24 pages. However, the three main points of this bill are that the Department of Justice will be able to expedite the process, reporting, and handling of hate crimes. These grants that are being handed out to these governments will train police and sheriff departments better to be able to handle these hate crimes. And then the last main point is that it will be much easier for people to report hate crimes if they experience one. So one example of it is that they would be able to set up hate crime hotline. And while this is an act in response to the hate of Asian Americans against or because of COVID, this really will help any person who experiences any hate crime.
All right, so that concludes our presentation. We have a bunch of works cited. So these are it kind of corresponds to each section. So like these blue slides are for the first part of the presentation with Carson and Olivia. So yeah, and we'll link this presentation in the chat so that everybody can kind of go through them and use these as a jumping off point for if you want to do your own research. This is okay. And then this is for the Supreme Court cases, I believe. And then we found these two books that we would really recommend you read if you want to do more in-depth research by Erica Lee. And as you can see, there's a photo and stuff. And then yeah, so thanks for coming. We really appreciate your support, even if there's just a few of us here today. But like, even if we can just educate one person, we would say it's a success. So we're gonna open it up to Q&A in a second, but first we wanted to mention our Instagram account where we post informational infographics, and our website, which has many resources and more, which are both on the screen. So now, if you guys have questions, feel free to ask them and we'll have one of the presenters answer. Okay, so we have one question from Kathy Lee, and it says, can you talk a bit about your efforts to change your school's curriculum? So I guess like I can answer. So basically ECAAR it was founded on like this idea where we're trying to fix the school's curriculum or like add things in that that are kind of more holistically representative of the student population, including Asian Americans. So one of the things we're doing is like, with all of this research we've compiled, we've created fact sheets and stuff for teachers if they did. So first of all, I guess we should mention that we've formed good relationships with a lot of teachers from our school who maybe are our advisors or we've discussed stuff with, specifically like, yeah, basically just people at our school. And then we're talking to them and trying to convince them to include stuff into their curriculum. And so if a teacher, say, decides like, hey, this year I want to include something about Asian American history, then we have a bunch of resources compiled that they can use as a jumping off point to form a curriculum. Suggested activities are there too. One major example of something we did was we have a master document that we compiled of Japanese, or like basically the Pacific theater of World War II and the stuff that happens there, specifically like the atrocities from the Japanese American, or sorry, not Japanese American, from like the Japanese imperial state. So yeah, that was the main thing we did this year. And then we've also been in talks with our principal about getting more representation through his messages to the student population and the student body. And yeah. Do you guys want to add anything to that? Okay. Okay, so it doesn't really look like there's too many more questions. So if you guys have any more questions, I guess you can stay behind and ask them, but I don't want to like take up a whole ton of your guys' time today. We really appreciate you guys attending and paying attention and everything. But yeah, if you guys have any questions, stay behind. But otherwise, I think we can let people start heading up.
So maybe we could open the mic to people who prefer to speak. Ask questions, verbally instead of typing them. Okay, so when the recording will be posted right after this on our YouTube channel, the CACA Seattle YouTube channel, and the link will be on our website at cacaseattle.org. So that's the answer for people who want to watch it. There were many more people who actually signed up that then could make it today. So I think recording will be really, really interesting to them when they get a chance to watch it when it cools down. It's kind of hot. All right. So I want to thank Garrett, Carson, Lauren, Olivia, Sophia, and Jada for taking the time today to speak with us and share their knowledge. And I want to congratulate them for all of the hard work and the work that they've done to educate all the people around Seattle. And hopefully you guys can take this even broader and show, how your advocacy can make a change in the world. So I do appreciate it. And I want to thank you very much. Any last chance for questions? It's an awesome group of kids. Thank you. All right. Well, thanks everybody. I hope you stay cool today and have a good rest of the week.
And I'm just making a copy of the presentation really quickly without the students' names on it and stuff, just to share with everybody. And I'll be posting that in like 2 seconds here.
Okay, because Betty wanted to get the resource list. Yeah. Yeah, and if you could email that to me, I can send it out to folks who are interested.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello, I actually have a question, even though we're almost done here. So
You're on mute.
how about now?
Okay.
Okay. Well, first I was saying I'm really impressed with the everything you guys are doing. I think this is really great. My question is, I'm not sure if you covered this, but when would you say the stereotype of Asians in America changed from being incapable and not, you know, being able to do certain work to a model minority?
That's a great question. I can talk a little bit about it and then other people can add in. So, as we talked about in the Transcontinental Railroad, I feel like the stereotype that Asian Americans are incapable was kind of, I feel like it was kind of a given that the people here, automatically um, just gave to the Asian Americans upon arrival, because if you go back and look at how they've treated people of color that are not Asian Americans, they have already developed this belief that people of color are just simply inferior to people who are white. But I think, as Carson said, like the Transcontinental Railroad was like a huge, like, world-changing accomplishment. So the fact that the Chinese laborers were able to pull that off, I think that really changed the perspective and into the model minority. I don't know. What do other people think?
Personally, I would also say like this idea of yellow peril played a big role. So even from the start, like although a lot of people thought like, oh, Chinese people are incompetent and stuff like that, like for example, Charles Crocker didn't think that like Chinese workers would be even a possibility to get like the railroad done. There was also a more prevailing myth that was like that Chinese people were slimy and like dirty and cunning. And I think that we can see very easily how kind of this idea that Chinese people are very cutthroat and stuff can evolve to become like Chinese people are good worker bees and kind of the model minority myth we have now. So I think also it's worth mentioning that like the stereotype of the model minority and stuff like that, the roots of it go back to all the way even when people thought that Chinese people were, or Asian people in general were incompetent. So yeah. Anyone else want to add anything?
Okay. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, thank you again. Have a great rest of the day. Take care.